Like if you have that kind of architectural divide, and if you're thinking about the new tools as agentic software, then I think this data network effect idea is probably the strongest moat that one could really build in this type of software. And I would posit that if we took this to the logical extreme, if things pan out, then this lock-in effect will be probably even stronger than the system of record lock-in effect. So just to end on something more specific, if an agentic CRM company were to unseat Salesforce for a particular segment in the market, then the lock-in effect from the data network effect of the user's data making the agents better in that ecosystem will be so strong that it is not likely that another force will be able to disrupt it unless we have another type of platform shift. Welcome to another episode of Agentic Data. This is episode 9, and I'm one of your hosts, Joseph Moon. Today we have some news items and also some additional thoughts as a continuation from our previous episodes. First news that I want to talk to you about is this announcement co-led by Palantir and NVIDIA. In this video, we can see that Jensen Huang is claiming that the Palantir Ontology platform is probably the single most important enterprise stack in the world, the Palantir Ontology. I think this is in line with what we talked about during our previous episode, where I said that I think within perhaps half a year, the concept of an enterprise ontology is going to be a table stakes discussion, a consensus idea, in the same way that agentic browsers are a consensus idea now. It wasn't before, but I think starting with the browser company and its pivot from a regular browser to an agentic browser, an agent-first browser, companies like Perplexity following quickly thereafter, as well as companies like OpenAI following thereafter as well. I think we're going to see something similar here. I think that the ontology is quite a powerful idea, and I think the data community is really latching onto this as well in the form of the ontology being a natural extension of the semantic layer. It's not the same thing, but it's perhaps a superset. It's a much broader definition that borrows a lot of concepts from the semantic layer. So the semantic layer traditionally in BI is thought of this layer that translates business queries of business concepts into the base SQL queries that could be translated against your data warehouse, thereby getting the data that you need. And generally speaking, you have measures and dimensions that are used to cut your data in a way that is presentable to the end user. And I think this is, to some degree, it's an artifact of how data was made into cubes and sliced and diced in the era where data compute was quite expensive. I think this might be an artifact of times when data had to be pre-computed and metrics had to be pre-computed and cached so that you could get different cuts of the cubic data projected onto the final result. So for example, say revenue might have different dimensions, like a time dimension, let's say per day. You might have a dimension by countries and region, and also by business unit and so forth. And the idea is that these dimensions could cut the revenue metrics into many different dimensions in a hypercube. And that hypercube becomes the central unit in which the data is observed. For example, what is the revenue in Q1 of this year only for the United States is a query that actually takes the hypercube object and then cuts that across different dimensions and then presents you with that revenue. So I think, okay, so that is sort of likely the artifact of times when data compute was expensive, and then that kind of cubic data transformation was parlayed into the modern BI stack, so to speak, the modern BI tooling. And companies like Looker, Omni, etc., have adopted this measures of dimensions type of semantic modeling and introducing a semantic layer to handle these requests. But I think what Palantir has done is way beyond that, which is just adopting ontology as this philosophical backbone of how all your business concepts relate to each other and how that could be activated to get to business insights. And this is a profound thing that Palantir did. And I think this has the opportunity to really expand beyond just mere BI, which is generally speaking taking data out of data warehouses. But like Jensen is saying here, you could unify both unstructured and structured data and then unify the concepts with an ontology and then really get to business insights after that, after translating through the ontology layer. And Jensen is really talking about Palantir and NVIDIA working together to propel this new future. And one could think of a few different ways that this is done. A very simple way is that the GPUs that NVIDIA produces will be directly used by Palantir in the form of AI agents. That's one very simplistic way of understanding what's happening. A second, less simplistic but still straightforward way is that NVIDIA has been working on GPU accelerated computing for quite a long time. And a part of GPU accelerated computing is GPU accelerated data computing, namely things like GPU accelerated query engines. And I think I had some friends working on GPU accelerated SQL engines and so forth. While this is not quite mainstream yet, this GPU accelerated query engine concept, I think this concept has some legs to some degree because I think finally it makes sense for a data query engine and the large language model query engine, so to speak, to come together and use the same hardware. We might be going into a world in which there have been many advances in the CPU market and in parallel computing, wherein you chain together a bunch of CPU threads and shard across different memory units and also CPU units to get to complex computation. We might be going into an era where we take advantage of the explosion in GPU popularity due to AI and co-locate GPU accelerated LLM computing, which is basically matrix operations, as well as data computing, which is effectively just distributed computing of analytical data sets. So that actually might happen on the same hardware or the same set of hardware, namely the GPUs. And if that happens, I think Palantir is one of the companies that could benefit from this type of situation. And I think this is even more than companies like Snowflake, Databricks, etc. The data infra companies could benefit from because the data infra companies already have their core underlying architecture that they have built over more than a decade. But Palantir does not completely rely on a single data infra definition or a vendor. Of course, they are an all-in-one solution when possible, swapping out some of the infra layer with accelerated compute. This can make a lot of sense. And I think this is something that NVIDIA likely wants to latch onto. And I think one of the things that I've heard folks talk about, like Mark Benioff at Salesforce, is that this FDE propelled business model is an excellent business model in some capacity just because of the price point that folks could, Palantir could sell into customers, which can vary from say $10 million to even $100 million per customer. And this type of business model might seem quite attractive to a company like Salesforce that is really selling a seat for a few $100s a month. NVIDIA is playing this game where they're latching onto all sorts of growth areas, and they might be looking at the ontology layer as one way to latch onto the growth. But a more profound read of the situation might be this consolidation of consensus around this ontology concept. Okay, so there's that news. Moving on to some other things that we have been seeing in the market. Recently, the data notebook company, Deepnote, has been open sourced. So this is an interesting move in the market, not only because of this particular news itself, but just from a more abstract chess playing move that is happening in the market. First of all, like we have found previously in running HyperQuery, our previous company, we've learned that the data notebook market is not a market. Data notebook is really an interface, and data notebook as an IDE is not something that could be easily monetizable just because of the shape of the market. And it seems like Deepnote is squarely the number 2 player in the data space. In full disclosure, we sold HyperQuery, our company, and merged with Deepnote. So we don't own any equity in Deepnote, but we have good things to say about Yakub, and we're big supporters. They're number two in the sort of the closed source space, and I think a very interesting move and a valid move in fighting against some headwinds that they might be facing, Deepnote might be facing, is to just lock itself in as the winning open source standard rather than fight the same exact battle that it was fighting before against players like us and say Hex and even other notebook players like notebooks offered by Google. So it's an interesting move. And I think the data notebook space is also evolving with newer players like Marimo notebooks, which are effectively just the second iteration on top of Jupyter and it's becoming quickly adopted by data practitioners. So I think this is a very interesting move and also signals the maturation of the modern data stack at large. So best of luck to Yakub and all the data notebook players out there. Let's move on to the next topic. So we see that Cursor has released their own model called Composer. And I think this is making some headlines. Composer is a new model we built at Cursor. We used RL to train a big mixture of experts model to be really good at real world coding and also very fast. Excited for the potential of building specialized models to help in critical domains. And I think we're going to see this pop up from other companies and vendors in the AI space at large. And I think because large language models are commoditizing fairly quickly, because open source offerings from Chinese labs as well as other labs around the world have been quickly catching up to the performance standards of closed models. I think for speed, security, and also function specificity reasons, I think having one's own model is going to be beneficial in a lot of ways. And it's certainly something that we're thinking about at Oxygen Intelligence. And it is something that I think a lot of companies are thinking about. I think once you have control over the base model as well, I think you do have tight control over how everything operates within your agentic system. So both the software end, the model end, as well as the infra end, and you get to construct something very tightly knit, which will give you the absolute best product experience possible. There's that aspect. And also, I think one of the things that companies like Cursor and Windsurf and Devin have are just an immense amount of unstructured coding data that it gets to use to train its own models. So large language models, how they're trained in terms of pre-training in a unsupervised way where the transformer object tries to learn patterns on unstructured data, and having a gigantic corpus of coding data, and also with labels at the end of the day, because these companies will have labels on whether a user accepted what the model suggested, and all sorts of other action information that indicates that whether the response by the model was good or not in a high level reductive sense. So that's extremely important information and useful information for folks to bundle into the base model itself. And instead of fine tuning it and really getting the gains to be had on the incumbent hyperscaler language model developer side, namely OpenAI and Anthropic, et cetera. From an economics standpoint and from a unit economics and scalability perspective, Cursor might have made a decision to try this method out in which they release their own model. So this is very interesting. And I read a lot of posts about folks saying that, hey, a lot of companies are really giving away dollar bills for 50 cents, 80 cents on the dollar, and it's not really scalable. Other folks saying, hey, this is sort of what happens in a platform shift where things are moving very quickly, akin to, say, like Uber or Airbnb really operating at cost or maybe burning a lot of cash in the beginning just to get to dominance and then figuring out the margin strategy. This is sort of playing out in the AI space as well. Infrastructure, if you're purely selling infrastructure like services, then maybe the margin argument has more of a merit. But I think on the application layer, there's always room to be found in getting to better margins. And I think developing your own models and also hosting and getting economies of scale on your own models might be one way that folks are already moving in this direction to get to better margins. And this is fairly fast in the large scheme of things of how fast things are moving and how fast margins are actually improving in these companies. So that was an interesting read on what's going on in the market. And there's like this inside scoop that I wanted to talk about, which is there's some sources close to companies like Cognition Labs and Amazon and folks that are building coding tools like Devin, like Cursor, like Kira, which is Amazon's version of an agentic IDE. A lot of sources close to those sources are saying that it's pretty obvious to these code first companies, so coding agents or agentic IDE companies, to first tackle this CodeGen space from a general purpose coding perspective of like trying to automate just coding in all domains, to getting a little bit more specific as like the second act in getting into data analytics and data analysis and data science and machine learning as a sort of a second act to this. Of course, this is more specific, like data engineering, data science, machine learning, AI engineering, way more specific, but it makes a lot of sense that they view this as sort of like as an offshoot of their main thing that they did, which is CodeGen at large. So I've been hearing some whispers here in the domain, and there are some whispers that maybe folks might be moving into things that are just not related to coding at all, like design or business processes using CodeGen as a primitive. So I think just like we saw that the sharing economy concept that was really enabled by the mobile revolution got some really enduring concepts like having marketplaces like Airbnb and Uber really persisted, things like food delivery in the form of Uber Eats, DoorDash. These things were thematically enabled by a technological shift. The technological shift of code generation being something that could be done effectively, I think will have profound first order, second order, and third order effects. And my bet on the situation is that not only simply is CodeGen simply going to really affect anything that has to do with code that are already being done in code, things like just purely coding in Python and Rust and C++, building your backends and front ends and what have you, JavaScript, what have you, as well as more specific and more specialized fields like data science, machine learning, AI engineering, etc. Those things are sort of easy to understand that CodeGen will affect. But not only that, but I think because CodeGen is so good and accurate and has high coverage, we may see processes that one may have thought to not be automatable through code start to become automatable. For example, design or something like marketing, having maybe a DSL or some sort of programming language or something similar to a programming language might emerge in trying to automate these processes that were generally not code first. Something to think about here. And finally, I think the final thing that I want to talk about is this concept of supervisors and monitors that I saw. And this is from a post from Fred Taylor, the CEO of Sierra. And he writes on Twitter, rather than relying on manual checks or static rules, Sierra's platform enables you to use AI supervisors and monitors to make agents dependable, correcting them in real time, and continuously evaluating the quality of every conversation. I thought that this was a very interesting take on things. And I think this is really taking the concept of AI agents to the logical extreme, which is all these checks and observability and monitoring that folks used to do can now be supplanted and abstracted away in the form of AI agents. And this has a number of benefits, and the chief benefit being high levels of automation. And not only that, the instructions to the AI agents can be codified in natural language or structured natural language. So having upkeep of these systems can become very, not only just portable, but just more scalable and just more flexible overall. Of course, right now, it just seems like automation is really at play here in the benefit of really refactoring just general human in the loop sort of checks and monitoring. That might be the thing that we think is going to really be impactful. But I would posit that there are second and third order effects that we're just not able to think about right now in pushing things and refactoring things into AI agents. I think every time there is a critical mass of folks wanting to refactor things into a different category of things, like when a separation of concerns is introduced, like the separation of storage and compute, or separation of the control plane and the data plane, or what have you, that's the separation between sort of the application plane and the intelligence plane, or what have you, in this separation of concerns, then different things that one did not expect on having positive consequences tend to arise. And I think it's something that we could anticipate to happen in the future as we refactor things that were more software like in nature, like rule based checking and sort of this observability based monitors and so forth, where all the system was doing is actually collecting a bunch of logs, and humans are checking up on the logs using GUIs and pretty charts and so forth. That kind of behavior might get supplanted by a whole new type of behavior where an agent actually builds the GUI on the fly on any information that a human wants to look at, instead of having predefined GUIs, for example. And it's sort of akin to what Elon Musk, I think, said recently in a podcast, where he thinks that the future of computing is sort of phones being edge devices that are effectively just inference devices that beam whatever you want at that particular moment using AI. And there will be no applications and like statically or hard wired applications or hard edged applications, but rather very flexible AI systems that could like project in real time what you want. This is sort of going in this direction, where if everything on the application layer starts to become abstracted away by the AI agent, then one would think that real time renditions of the information that you want to see will become the de facto standard of how things operate. And if, say, internal enterprise tooling becomes like that, wherein it is much more ergonomic and much more effective for an enterprise user to just try to get whatever information they want to get at that particular point in time and let the AI agent handle everything. If that behavior becomes more normalized, then it would follow that even for consumers, that kind of behavior will become more normalized. For example, instead of tapping on a bunch of screens to buy something on Amazon, if you could just tell an AI agent to render a screen full of different products that one may want to get from Amazon and many other sources, and the agent actually figures out how to execute all those orders on the back end, then behavior of just getting what you want at all times through generations of the UI just in time will also become consumer behavior as well. So I think this is a place wherein perhaps enterprise use cases might define what may be possible in the consumer use case, as opposed to a lot of the times like consumerized enterprise software is one in which consumer software patterns really affect the enterprise patterns. But this might be opposite in this case, just because a lot of the low hanging and high ROI workflows around this type of auto gen UI behavior might come from an enterprise setting. But this is too early to tell. And so we'll keep a close eye on how things develop here. Okay. And so the final thing that I want to just talk about and think about is just the nature of data network effects in agentic businesses. So I think part of the reason why I think if agentic systems of record plus system of intelligence type of companies for, say, IT, for data analytics, for HR, for sales, for marketing, all these things, if they take a foothold on the enterprise setting that we live in the near future, then I think there is this data network effect that has never existed in traditional software systems. And this is really in the realm of getting to better usage data when the agent does something. And this is tied back to the cursor code editor, wherein if you have a bunch of code data that users are inputting, as well as users are getting from the model, and also label data from users accepting or denying changes, then one has like a large corpus of stuff that could be put back into the system. In this case, is put back directly into the large language model. But for, say, like a sales or marketing system, if you have an agentic system that gets you users the desired output, and you have a lot of input data from the user, whether that was correct or not, and all the labels a model or a system needs to have in order to improve itself, then better modeling of what the user wants, that kind of behavior, let's say some sort of ontology over the space of all actions, gets you better coverage over the space of all actions that needs to be taken, then the user then is able to give labels to the action space that it gets out. And then from that user's data, that could be trained back into the model to get to better performance of the AI agent or the language model that is powering things underneath. And then that cycle continues. So like better data, better accuracy of the model, better data from usage. So this perpetual cycle continues, right? And I think it exists in some form on systems of record companies like Salesforce in a very loose way, in the sense of, if you're a system of record, you input data, and then you use the system of record, and then you talk to your customer support rep or salesperson or whatever, and give you like feedback on, hey, since your data is already here, I want these additional features X, Y, and Z. So that super slow feedback loop existed before, but now you have an insanely fast feedback loop wherein, because large language models are such high coverage, so very high recall things, objects, you could try to ask it whatever you feel like asking, and then it will generally try to come up with a reasonable answer. It might not be very precise, so it might be lower precision, but the recall is insanely high on whatever you want to ask. So from that telemetry data, then one could try to really fill in a lot of the action space underlying that kind of ask to the agent. And so we might see that if folks and if vendors are able to unseat or maybe augment the system of record companies that already exist at large, then you could start to compound this like snowball that will really snowball into a gigantic snowball. And you're going to have some sort of data network effects, and also at the same time some lock-in, because the data network effect will only propel the model forward and the system forward, in that the accuracy will be insanely high. And at a certain point, the coverage of the things that an agent is able to do will far outpace the coverage space that could be mapped out by GUI workflows. And the counter to that is that when the recall is really high, the precision might be lower, in the sense of like you're just giving random answers to cover for the question space, but you're not getting good answers. But that could be modified and figured out over time as you get more usage data. So theoretically, you could get to very high coverage, so high recall and high precision, if one is able to establish this data network loop. And this is something that I think folks talk about in the sense of reinforcement learning with human feedback on an agentic system. A lot of researchers talk about this if you're a model company and so forth, but I think there is some dialogue that is missing from folks that are building software. And I think this notion of the new software companies are agentic software companies. So you have a headless software component, which is a software that the agent gets to use to execute basically the tools that the agent gets to use, but designed for the agent. And also other component, which are the agents themselves. Like if you have that kind of architectural divide, and if you're thinking about the new tools as agentic software, then I think this data network effect idea is probably the strongest moat that one could really build in this type of software. And I would posit that if we took this to the logical extreme, if things pan out, then this lock-in effect will be probably even stronger than the system of record lock-in effect. So just to end on something more specific, if an agentic CRM company were to unseat Salesforce for a particular segment in the market, then the lock-in effect from the data network effect of the user's data making the agents better in that ecosystem will be so strong that it is not likely that another force will be able to disrupt it unless we have another type of platform shift. And the next platform shift might be something like quantum computing, where it just completely overtakes the bits based model of computation, and thereby most software that we use have to be refactored anyways. But apart from that, I can't really think of any other disruptive force that might be stronger than this like data network effect built by data agents and augmented by data agents. So there's some thoughts here. I think it's really interesting to keep track of everything that is happening in the space between data and AI. And this really helps us builders think about how to build the next generation of agentic software. Things are not so clear on how this should be done. There are analogies from the past, but I feel excited to work on something new every day, which necessitates a study of history as well as just first principles thinking and thinking about why agents will really fundamentally change how tools operate in the enterprise. So there you have it. This is Agentic Data episode 9. We'll see you next time.